The following is an AZPM original production.
Hello and welcome to this latest edition of the Press Room from the radio studios of AZPM. I'm your host, Steve Goldstein. A lot of interesting topics to talk about. We'll get to them in just a minute. After I introduce our distinguished panelists, Paul Ingram of the Tucson Sentinel, John Washington of AZ Luminaria, Alisa Reznick of KJZZ, and Christopher Conover of AZPM. Thank you all for being here today. Paul, something that used to be called a State of the City is now called a Report to Tucsonans, and this was Mayor Romero, I guess, giving her sixth. Was this a pretty conventional laundry list, or did something stand out for you?
I mean, she really talked about many of the main issues. The really central issues is crime, and then she really spent a lot of time talking about water and securing Arizona, Tucson's water future. So there's really two central elements. And one of the things she talked about, of course, there's always this sort of state of the city is also the state of the city is good, and there's also kind of a we've been successful. Here's the things we've done. So she really went through all those things, talking about that, talking about the 311 system that they've done. That's doing more services for families, doing more things for people who are homeless, trying to get getting people into some kind of housing or some kind of shelter services, and really trying to improve on those things, and then talking about what they want to do in the future. One of the central things she talked about also, of course, is the 414 proposal, which is going to be a sales tax that's going to be added, and it's going to raise millions of dollars that's going to be used to improve services, buy more police cars, possibly buy a plane for the police, and also do some more things for housing first.
John, I think what stood out for me about Prop 414 is that Doug Ducey's been out of office for more than 2 years, and yet Mayor Romero decided to mention that he's the reason that 414 needs to go forward, because legislation that he signed ended up taking some money away from cities, including Tucson.
That's right. Yeah, the flat tax, the state flat tax is why that the city's is expected to pull in a lot less revenue, and so this is why they're hunting for more. I think what is more controversial is not that the city needs money, is how they're planning to spend it. And so there were protesters, and there's a whole coalition of groups that are already trying to oppose 414 on grounds that it's not doing enough for the affordable housing front and is prioritizing further enforcement measures. Yeah.
Alisa, anything stand out to you specifically about either what Romero said about the past or the future?
Well, I mean, I think, like John mentioned, there has been sort of that steady opposition to 414, despite the city's kind of pretty constant talking up of 414. So I do think it's going to be interesting to see how that shakes out, especially as we look deeper into issues with policing. I mean, we may talk later about Ryan Remington and what sorts of funding is going where for the city. So affordable housing is something that the city has put money into, has directed federal funding towards, but the question of whether city funding and taxpayer money should go towards affordable housing initiatives is one that has continued to come up, I think.
That is interesting. Chris, what about you?
When it comes to 414, I thought it was interesting right after the mayor talked about it, the Tucson Chamber, which is about to not be called the Tucson Metro Chamber anymore because they're merging with Sun Corridor, came out against it. Traditionally, they have always been the sponsor of this speech, but they weren't this year. And then Romero on the affordable housing end followed up yesterday with the ribbon cutting for Milagro on Oracle, which is an affordable housing for seniors on the site. If you're familiar with Tucson, it's on the site of the old No-Tell Motel. So took it all forward right away. But it's going to be interesting to see how 414 does.
Yeah, and Paul, bigger picture when it comes to working with the federal government, since President-elect Trump won again in November, there's been discussion about how does that affect Pima County, how does that affect Tucson specifically. Did the mayor get into that much at all? I
mean, a little bit. She, because of course the report to the city is kind of, is about what things are going well and how we're going to look in the future. But there definitely is this sense. First, I mean, there's a lot of the money that was spent on affordable housing and these kinds of projects come from two major bills that were passed during the Biden administration, the infrastructure law and also ARPA. And so both of those put millions and millions of dollars in the cities. And of course, both those bills are basically done. And that money is going to be wrapped up. There's a little bit of money left, and the sense is what happens if the Trump administration decides to claw that money back that hasn't been spent. And then there's definitely a sense that there won't be future money. And there may be also like some federal grants may be restricted or cut because, the Trump administration may want to use some of these grants as kind of a weapon to sort of make cities do what they want them to do. And so everyone's kind of, I think, in a crouch position about basically knowing there's going to be less money. And so trying to figure out how to spend the money that they have, but also what that future means.
Yeah, Alisa, later in the program, we'll talk specifically about immigration-related legislation. But did you expect the mayor to sort of come out fighting a little bit? Because there's a major disagreement between Tucson officials and the Trump administration about how immigration border security should be handled.
I think that's been an open question for local officials and state officials. I mean, it's certainly been a question that's come up every single press conference that I've attended of Hobbs, whether it's myself or any other reporter that's there. How will you handle a situation where there are potentially mass deportations, like the Trump administration has talked very extensively about, incoming Trump administration, that is. Mayor Romero did put out, a short kind of basic statement around mass deportations and how she would direct TPD to not prioritize that kind of enforcement. But she was also pretty careful, and I think that has been the tack of most officials, except for AG Hobbs has. I'm sorry, AG Engel has been.
Mays.
AG Mays has been much more direct with that, but Hobbs has kind of said she would not support any policies that break apart Arizona communities without really going further. And I think Romero was certainly more direct, but still pretty vague. And I think it's partially because of all this funding that's tied into Tucson, all this collaboration that's tied into Arizona and CBP and the federal government at this point. It's kind of an unknown. I think there are bills, as we'll talk about later, that would target so-called sanctuary cities. So there is, I think, this sort of idea, as Paul said, of sort of crouching and waiting to talk too much in detail about that.
Yeah, so John, it's interesting with what Chris said about the Tucson Chamber, and that there's also that other side. I don't know if Mayor Romero really wants to start a fight from her left flank, or she also doesn't necessarily want the Trump administration targeting Tucson right away.
Yeah, I mean, we've mentioned before, I think, that there's a big difference between not actively engaging in immigration enforcement and hampering federal enforcement. Mm-hmm. And I haven't seen anything signaled by state or county that they'll actually hamper any immigration enforcement measures that are going to be in place. In some other cities, that is happening, though. I mean, like the Denver mayor, I think the Chicago mayor has also signaled that they would actually actively try to resist raids and things like that. But we haven't seen that in local officials.
Yeah,
on the budget end, right before the holidays, I was talking with some county officials, Pima County officials, and they're worried about changes to asylum laws and asylum funding because that money is used by the county to have a shelter. Many of us will remember, all of us at the table will remember when Border Patrol was just dropping busloads of people off at the bus station. The county worked something out, so they took them to a shelter so they weren't just doing street releases. That money could possibly be going away, and county officials are really scrambling, trying to figure out what happens if that money goes away for that shelter right now. So there's as they look at the new administration, and again, as all of us have said, they may not actively be resisting what the administration wants to do. They have to be very careful because they don't want to lose that money.
Yeah, we'll return to the issue of immigration in just a moment. But Chris, I'll stay with you since you mentioned the county and some of the challenges. Pima County Administrator Jan Lescher got a new contract approved by the Board of Supervisors. I thought this was an interesting vote in the sense that Supervisor Matt Hines didn't vote for it because it wasn't enough money. And we're talking about $330,000 plus car allowance plus other things. But it's only a 2-year contract as opposed to Chuck Huckleberry typically was getting 4-year contracts. So ultimately, what do you make of why Jan Lescher was so attractive in the size of this contract?
Well, some of it on the 2-year contract, as Lescher told the Sentinel, I guess it was Dylan who wrote the story at the Sentinel, she really only wants a 2-year contract. She turned 70 this year, or just turned 70. So she's looking for the off-ramp. Now, the contract can be renewed on a 1-year basis a couple of times going forward, but she's now up to at least base pay, what Huckleberry was making. And I thought Hines' comment was an interesting one. You don't see people abstain because it's not enough very often. That was a new one for me. And he said, no, with her experience, she should be paid more. She was chief of staff for Homeland Security Secretary Napolitano because she had worked for her as governor. She was head of the Southern Arizona office when Napolitano was governor, so she has a lot of experience. Of course, Lescher came out and said, no, this package is fine. She did not say she wanted more than that.
Well, Paul, even in the piece that Dylan wrote, I think there was a quote where Lescher said, early drafts of the contract were more than this, but this is okay.
Right. Yeah, and it's definitely, I mean, there's this, we didn't see the contract, of course, right before, which was part of kind of Steve Christie's complaint about it, was that he really wanted it to be transparent. He actually wanted it read into the record. And when they didn't want to do that, he didn't go in exec. So he just instead sat outside and did paperwork, I guess, while everyone else went and talked about what the actual contract was going to be. The other thing I thought was interesting, Lescher said that one of the reasons she wanted 2 years was also so that the next contract was being negotiated when they had a full board. They just of course, there was just an election. Most of the board members were just elected. We have a brand new board member, Jen Allen. So in 2 years is a good time. People will have some experience. And of course, theoretically, if the next person comes in, then they would have 4-year contracts. And of course, then the board, it wouldn't be a brand new board who'd just gotten elected. Instead, it would be an experienced board who'd been around for a little while.
Yeah, John, it makes sense that Lescher, with her experience, would make as much as Huckleberry did. I mean, obviously talk about equal pay for things, but it seems like a lot of money, considering all the issues that government has had when we're talking about funding. There may be budget shortfalls. Who knows?
Yeah, it's pretty handsome remuneration. I mean, it's 6 times or so median household income of Tucson residents. That seemed to be sort of some of Christie's complaints, but he was also calling into question a couple of, I don't know, trying to find something to latch onto of issues that she has had, or that issues that have come up under her leadership. But I think it felt a little bit like he was grasping at straws there. He was the only voice of criticism for how much he was making, but it's still a lot.
Yeah, but I mean, the city of Tucson and Pima Community College pays their folks like $325,000. And what's the U of A president's new salary? It's almost $400,000 plus,
something
with like a bunch of benefits and things.
Right.
So, I mean, somebody who's in charge of Pima County, which is this huge rangy district that goes pretty far and has more than 1.2 million people roughly. So somebody who's in charge of that should probably get something commensurate with who runs Pima Community College or the University of Arizona.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
It did feel like this flurry of concern about not seeing the contract for a couple of days before that happened. And of course, Christie was like, let's hear it read aloud. I think then Supervisor Grijalva said, well, like, I don't want to read it out loud right now. I need it to be the figures to be as accurate as possible. And we know the rest. Mm-hmm. So I do think it seemed like that was the sort of constant worry in the couple of days leading up. Like, let's see the contract. Where's the contract? And yeah, I guess I'm actually not positive how that's worked in the past. Has it been released to the public for a couple of days ahead of that? Is this an abnormal process that this contract has not been seen or read?
Well, it's sort of tricky because for so long we had Chuck Huckleberry was sort of the essentially negotiated the contract with the board ahead of time and was in charge of the county for 30 years. So we sort of haven't had a really brand new administrator who's just coming in for a very long time. So I think that's part of it. We just really haven't seen this process where like TUSD, where they had a new person every 4 to 6 years, you got to see how that process really churned. We haven't had really a new administrator since Jan was Huckleberry's assistant. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit tricky, but I think I think you make a good point in that the contract probably should have been produced before they were going to go to a vote so that we could see it, could talk about it, and really analyze it. But that's also something that's supposed to be done in executive session.
Sure. I was more just curious if that is a normal thing, because I think that was the main, in media leading up to that, to the contract actually being passed and everything, I think the big question was like, where is the contract? And it made me curious whether this is an abnormal process that we don't see this contract.
Okay. Alisa, I'll stick with you then. The Laken Riley Act, which is a staple of Fox News, and yet, so it's a little bit surprising that Senators Mark Kelly and Senator Ruben Gallego have both come out in support of it, and even Senator John Fetterman, who used to be seen as pretty far left, and now we're not really sure at this point, has said something that if you can't get 8 Democrats to support this, there's something wrong with our party, and that's why we lost. Can you give us Cliff's Notes on what the Laken Riley Act is and why it's so controversial for Democrats to support it?
Yeah, I mean, and to be clear, both Kelly and Gallego supported this, as well as, Gallego kind of took to social media talking about why he supported it, tying it to border security and the need to fix our borders. And Governor Hobbs retweeted that. So I think it's not just, Democrats that are in D.C., but also Democrats that are here in the state. And it really signals, I think, the moment we're in immigration-wise in a bipartisan way, shifting very hardline, because this bill, even though I think the Laken Riley Act is being, discussed as this border security measure, a public safety measure, it is pretty hardline when you look at the details. I mean, it would require DHS to detain anyone who's arrested on charges like theft, shoplifting. So these are petty crimes, in terms of like the eyes of the public. Right. And I think it also brings up this question of whether or not, we know that ICE does not have those resources. Every single administration typically has had enforcement priorities, and, generally they are geared towards maybe homeland security or, anything within that larger umbrella. So the idea that you would require people who are arrested only on charges of, theft, larceny, shoplifting, is a pretty significant shift from what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, John, it seems like the winds of change are blowing. And it takes me back to Prop 314, which passed by a lot in Arizona. And yet I had the impression that some of the folks that Alisa mentioned were not in support of Prop 314, like Governor Hobbs, for example.
Yeah, I think the support, especially from Gallego, to a lot of people shows a maybe misunderstanding of what this bill will do. Fox News was reporting yesterday that he was saying that there are carve-outs for dreamers and minors when there are certainly not. Mm-hmm. I didn't see him say that. I don't think that was captured on video, but that is a little bit alarming. I mean, it's not a long bill. And I think, I remember having a conversation with Kelly a year or so ago about Title 42, and it was actually difficult to have a conversation with him how much he misunderstood how that measure was functioning. And I think there's a larger misunderstanding here too, and that is that this bill will do anything to stop crime. That is because there has been study after study that shows that actually immigrants commit far fewer crimes than native-born residents. And so I think that they are signaling that they want to do something, but how effective this is, what sort of constitutional problems are going to be arising because of this. I mean, mandatory long-term indefinite detention, perhaps. And one other thing that I think maybe is a little bit the Democrats shooting, or rather both parties shooting themselves in the foot, is another part of this bill is giving permanent standing to states to sue the federal government if they have any objection to the way that immigration bill is being enacted. And that is going to further gum up the works, which is part of the problem and how we got here in the first place.
Chris?
I think one of the things, I pulled the bill down yesterday, actually, and read it. And as John said, it's not a long read by any means. And it talks, as Alisa was saying, about Department of Homeland Security detaining people. It doesn't say where the Department of Homeland Security will be detaining them. It is not a budget bill. There's no mention of money in there. And we've seen in the past where, for example, we saw this when Mark Napier was sheriff of Pima County. If someone was arrested, tried, and convicted, someone who was undocumented in the country of, we'll say, shoplifting, and they were sentenced to 6 months in jail, and they're in the Pima County jail, and they had a detainer put on them that Border Patrol wanted them, sheriff's office would call and say, okay, we're letting this person out in 2 days. And Border Patrol would say, great, we'll be there in a week. And the sheriff's office is like, no.
Right.
We're done with them. Mm-hmm. We don't have a right to hold them, and we don't have the money and space to hold them. So one of my questions is, are the counties expected to hold these lower level criminals? And yes, if you're a shop owner, I understand that theft is a real problem, but it's not murder, rape, drug smuggling, human smuggling, that kind of thing. So there are a lot of questions in here for the local governments.
Well, I think the supposition is that the people will be held in immigration detention, which actually presents another difficulty.
Exactly.
Is that if they're only charged with a crime and they're held in immigration mandatorily, how are they going to be brought before a judge to have their criminal case borne out? And so they're going to be, and this is a problem that actually happens with immigration detention now, is that people aren't able to make their criminal court dates because they're in immigration detention, and they get further criminalized. So this might be another consequence of this.
And one thing, too, is the way that the structure of the immigration system is built in a civil system, which you don't get attorneys. It's really structured for a civil process. It's not designed for a criminal process. The other thing, too, is that, ICE already goes after people for saying larceny. If you steal enough stuff, you can be charged with grand larceny, in which case you immediately fall under ICE purview anyway. What this does is really lowers the threshold for somebody who would end up. And I think there's a huge constitutional question, because it essentially means you can't bond out. So if you get arrested for potentially shoplifting, you can't bond, you are going to be stuck. And I think you're right. I think Chris makes a really great point. You're going to be stuck in the Pima County Jail. And then that puts all the weight and also all the civil liability onto the counties. And that's why some of the counties have really avoided detainer requests. That's why they don't always answer those detainer requests, because ICE takes sometimes weeks or months sometimes to come and get somebody. And that puts all the weight and all the expense on the county jails.
All of you have made great points about this, but Alisa, the reason I wanted to bring up Laken Riley as the name of this act is that the big story about Laken Riley wasn't she murdered by an undocumented immigrant? And so when we're talking about shoplifting and theft, well, I think a lot of people, maybe not everyone in Pima County, not everyone in Tucson, but if there's a violent act committed, the perception that people have is quite different than whether someone shoplifted or was guilty of theft. So that seems confusing as well to me, that you have so many Democrats, who we mentioned, supporting this, because it doesn't feel like it's focused on the things that the average American would be focused on and worried about.
Sure. So. You're right. Laken Riley was a young nursing student who was killed during a jog in Georgia, out near her school. The person who is charged with her murder was just charged, faces life without the possibility of parole. So you're right. But I feel like it's just piling on,
whereas it's not really focused on.
Sure. Well, I think it sort of ends up what Democrats, in my view, have said about this is like bringing it back to this idea of border security and the need to fix the nation's borders, which has been a perennial comment by Republicans and also by Democrats, especially recently. And so I think it is in all aspects a pretty knee-jerk reaction to losing the election that these Democrats are supporting a bill like this, but it also has been a slow build to this. You've seen the Biden administration move towards hardline policies at the border. And I do think, to John's point, the second aspect of this piece of legislation is really important, the standing issue, because if you look at essentially every immigration policy that has been put forth by the Biden administration has been challenged by Texas and a host of other GOP-led states. If you think about the program for Haitians, Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, which would give basically a humanitarian parole, a temporary status to stay in the United States and work here, that was taken to court, and it was Texas had to prove, and the other states had to prove, that this program was harming their states. They were unable to prove that in court, and as a result, the case was dismissed. And so you see that, there's a very, very clear through line of how the judicial process works for these kinds of things that could change if the Laken Riley Act goes through. And it does feel really like a catch-all. Especially when we look at the funding issue for local governments. I mean, sheriffs right now are asking, at the state of the state, plan to ask for $50 to $100 million over the next 2 years to enforce Prop 314, and it hasn't even been able to go into effect yet.
John, very briefly.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other points here that I think is worth pointing out for the motivation of this is that the person who was charged with her murder had been previously arrested for a petty crime and then was released. Okay. And yet foisting responsibility for even that ultimate murder onto an entire group is what definitionally discriminatory. And I think this is the problem that a lot of the critics point out, is that you can't stop all crime no matter what, and especially if you criminalize or scapegoat an entire group of people based on individual acts, we get into really troubling.
Well, and a lot of people who've lived in Arizona for a while remember the Gang of Six, the Gang of Eight. To actually do comprehensive immigration reform, it's Congress that has failed, not necessarily individuals at the local level. We have about a minute left, John. I want to give a plug to a documentary that's going to be airing right after us called Death Behind Bars. It talks a lot about the reporting you had done in the Pima County Jail. Again, not a lot of time now, but what's the key thing you want viewers to look for when they tune in? Just a few seconds here.
So, I've been reporting on the jail for going on 3 years at this point, and for a few years we had one of the deadliest jails per capita in the nation. And while deaths have at least temporarily abated, there are still very serious problems there. And people who are locked into the jail undergo very trying, sometimes torturous conditions. And I think what I realized kind of early on is that if you only look at the jail itself, only looking like within the walls of the jail, you aren't going to be able to really understand the problem. And so what we try to do with this documentary is pull back a little bit and understand all the systems that are working to send people to jail, why people are criminalized, why people are held there for a long time, even if they haven't been charged or even if they haven't been convicted of anything yet. And really trying to underscore the urgency of ongoing problems inside.
That collaboration between AZPM and AZ Luminaria, Death Behind Bars, on PBS 6 coming up right after us. If you're on the radio listening to us, flip over to PBS 6 and you can watch Death Behind Bars. Thanks so much to our panelists this week on the press from Alisa Reznick of KJZZ, Christopher Conover of AZPM, John Washington of AZ Luminaria, Paul Ingram of the Tucson Sentinel. I'm Steve Goldstein. Thanks for being with us today. Join us again next time.